My name is Martin Flanagan. Like many Australians, I discovered George Johnston's My Brother Jack in the 1960s. I was in my teens. The book made no big impression upon me. 20 years later, I came to the age from Tasmania, and an older journalist said to me if I wanted to understand Melbourne, I had to read it. So I did. And yes, it deepened my relationship with the city and its past. Also at the age at that time was an old journalist called John Lay. He'd been at the Argus in 1946 when Charmian Clift was sacked for adultery with George Johnston. I asked John Lay what Charmian Clift was like. He replied, "A real peach." My Brother Jack can be seen as a morality play about journalism. The principal character, Melbourne journalist David Meredith, has by the end of World War II grown to a position of eminence as a war correspondent. But Meredith's a cheat and knows it. He can manufacture the appearance of meaning. He has this incurable facility with words. He can cover a battle without being there. The problem is that the hero of his novel, his brother Jack, is, if nothing else, authentic. Jack would be in the fighting, but a physical injury has precluded him from military service. Jack believes the war is what his brother Davey writes, and Davey knows he's a fraud, one with a big reputation. Enter Charmian Clift, or as she first appears in My Brother Jack, 22-year-old Lieutenant Cressida Morley, a highly literary, ambitious, untamed, and former Pix magazine Miss New South Wales beach girl. She and the George Johnston character fall in love. He leaves his wife for her. The Argus sacks her. He resigns in protest. And at this point, it's probably necessary to point out the dangerous proximity between George Johnston's journalism and his fiction, with the result that it is awfully tempting to read his fiction as journalism. And that is one reason why I think the book we are going to discuss today is important. It's a very disciplined reading of the available information about them. The book we're talking about today starts at the point where George Johnston and Charmian Clift decide to go and live in a place that's cheap and warm and go for it as writers. Go for broke, literally. They end up on the Greek island of Hydra. If you're into the George Johnston, Charmian Clift story to the extent that I am, Half the Perfect World is a must-have. Previously, in my view, much of the commentary on George and Charmian that I have read has taken them to some extent at their own word. There has been a certain politeness in discussions about them. This book is about the couple's 10 years on Hydra from 1955 to 1964 as part of an expatriate community. What makes this book special is that it not only explores what the couple wrote about Hydra, it reports on what other members of the island's expatriate community, most of whom fancied themselves as artists of some sort, thought of George and Charmian. Some of what they have to say is not at all polite, but the portraits which emerge of the couple in this book are far bigger than any I've read before. The book is also very well written. The authors, Tanya Dalziell and Paul Genoni, are academics who write with good tempo and felicity. The book speeds along. It is never abstract or unduly theoretical. Before we go to the authors, I just want to outline the story after the couple left Hydra. Clift guides Johnston to quote his big one, My Brother Jack. At what cost to herself is one of the questions. Back in Australia, she makes it big as a newspaper columnist, writing for the Sydney Morning Herald and Melbourne Herald. By the time she starts in journalism, She has already experienced the Great Depression, World War II, and real poverty. She had a depth of lived experience rare in Australian newspaper columnists of any age. She had intellect and erudition and eloquence. He, meantime, finished the second book in what is now known as the My Brother Jack trilogy. Titled Clean Straw for Nothing, it tells, among other things, of an affair Cressida Morley, Charmian Clift's literary persona, had while the couple were living on the island. Shortly before the publication of Clean Straw for Nothing, Clift committed suicide. She was 46. Johnston died 2 years later while working on the third book in the trilogy, Cartload of Clay. It finishes mid-sentence. Tragedy followed the family. George Johnston's daughter by his first marriage died of a drug overdose. His eldest son that he had with Clift died of alcoholism. Their daughter committed suicide. It is not being superficial to compare Clift and Johnston with Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. So I'll come first to you, Tanya. Can you tell me who you think Charmian Clift was? Can you paint a picture of her for us?
I will do my best to respond to that. I guess one way of starting to think about Clift is to think about the context of Hydra itself as the island, because to get a sense of what Clift was doing at that time is to also have a picture of the island itself. So Hydra at the time, so we're talking 1955, was a impoverished Greek island, and it had a very small population. And the way in which the social scene of Hydra worked was that most of the life lived was around this horseshoe-shaped harbour that was the main kind of life, and where the boats would come in and things would be unpacked, etc., etc. Now, I mention this because this is actually a really important way of starting to think about Clift at this time, because she was living on an island with her husband. They lived in close proximity for 24 hours a day, more or less, across 10 years. And during that time, there were a large number of people who would move in and out of their lives. And a really important moment in their cementing of their relationship with that island, which says a lot about Clift, is their purchasing of the house on the island, which we now know as the Australian House. And the purchasing of that house was a mark of faith in the relationship that Clift and Johnston had in their own relationship, which had been put under great strain in London, with Johnston having an affair. And it was also a marker of their commitment to art. So they actually went to Hydra because they were looking for a place for Clift to have a baby. She was pregnant. They were on the island of Kalymnos, and they moved to Hydra. And while on Hydra, they bought this house as a commitment to their family and to each other and to the arts. So in terms of thinking about the person that Clift was, I think that decision that they made to move from London to Kalymnos and then to this incredibly impoverished island suggests the kind of adventure that Clift was looking for, and also in a commitment to art. They went to Hydra to write, and that was their main purpose and drive. So she was a woman who was ambitious, prepared to take risks, was looking for new experiences in life, but also saw herself as a serious artist. So that commitment to the house on that island is a real helpful symbol for thinking about Clift as a woman.
She was she was a very unconventional person, wasn't she? She'd grown up at Kiama on the New South Wales coast. I read somewhere she didn't wear shoes until she was 13. And she had a pagan sort of dimension to her, which she was quite fascinated by.
Yeah, I think if pagan suggests that kind of sense of adventure and looking for risks and a kind of, I guess, unsettlement with what Australia at that time was seen to be offering her. There was a real discontent with post-war modernity in Australia at that time. Her and Johnston, luckily that they met, had this kind of shared ambition to see the world, to write together. So in that sense, the island, I guess, offered that opportunity to live out those desires and to also perhaps allow Clift that expression that you're suggesting that she had. I mean, her unconventionality was recognised by herself. She said, she kind of looked at her children at one stage in her writing and said, you know, what I'm an unconventional mother. I smoke, I drink, I have desires that I act on. And in that regard, she was unconventional. Also, if you think about the community, the Idriot community at the time as well, it was relatively conservative in terms of, the late 1950s. So in that sense, her presence on the island was something that marked out the differences from those around her.
Some people have compared the relationship to Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald in that they are two writers who ultimately feed off the same body of material for their stories. When she gets to Ithra, she's 32. Over the course of the next 10 years, she writes 3 books. She's also edits Johnston and is his muse. But do you believe, or do you have some feeling that in terms of their relationship, that she lost out creatively?
Well, in practical terms, she put aside her work to do the memory work that was necessary for my brother Jack. So in that sense, she was making that decision consciously to assist Johnston in that work. Whether she felt herself to be missing out, I think that was a kind of concern that she had throughout her career. So, she was a mother of 3 children. She had the demands of a house. They had a maid who assisted in that kind of everyday work. But I think she was continually striving to mark out a place for herself as a writer, to be recognised as such as well. So those photographs that are showing on the screen, there's one by James Burke, who we might talk about, and it shows her in the kitchen, and that is not the image that Clift would have wanted the world to receive of herself necessarily. She very much saw herself as a writer. She was a slow writer though, so whereas Johnston could, get out 10,000 words a day, she was much slower as a writer. So the family were requiring an income, and Johnston was tasked with that because he could write quickly and could push out these pot boilers, etc., etc. So, in that sense, I think Charmian was constantly trying to carve out a space for herself as an author in that context.
Come to you now, Paul. Can you give us a picture of George Johnston, a background picture, but who is he when he gets to the island? What's the story?
Well, George Johnston basically is a working class boy from Melbourne. He was brought up very close to here in Elstonwick. And what marked George out almost from the get-go was his passion for writing. And the one facility he had in life was this ability to write accurately and quickly. And he was always destined for a career in journalism of some sort. He started working with the Argus when he was about 15 or 16. He started submitting pieces based on the shipping coming in out of Melbourne port. So he was then appointed the shipping roundsman for the Argus before he was 20, and he'd be down here at the ports every day and have a great love affair with Melbourne dockside. But he was always going to be a writer. He was always going to be a journalist, and that was his great ambition, was to work with the big papers of Melbourne. And he found his way onto the permanent Argus staff when he was 20. And from there, of course, his life got consumed by the war, which came along when he was in his late 20s. And he was the first appointed Australian war correspondent. And again, as a war correspondent, he was marked out by his facility. He could write under any conditions, and he could still produce his 5,000 words a day. And he was greatly envied by his fellow correspondents for this ability to write quickly and accurately under often great pressure and difficult conditions. The end of the war, though, left him with a problem as to what to do next, because, as you pointed out, he was looked like he was marked out for stardom. He was called the golden boy of the Argus officers. He was given the job of being the first editor of the Australasian Post, which was managed by the Argus at that time, and he seemed destined for great things. But it was the relationship with Clift, in fact, that brought that thread of his life undone. When, as you noted, he was sacked, and they went to Sydney as a result. And I think at this stage he formed his great interest in writing fiction. And although it was journalism that then took him to London, because he had a job in London for 3 years with Australian Associated Press, that was not a happy period in their lives. Although they were initially thrilled to be in London and thrilled to be working on Fleet Street, they found it a cold, they found it very expensive. Post-war recovery was still going on. There was still a lot of physical and social reconstruction going on in the early 50s. and they formed this joint passion for going somewhere cheap and dedicating their lives to writing fiction. And so they, as Tanya noted, they went first to the island of Kalymnos, and they had a really good time on Kalymnos. They were about 8 or 9 months there. They wrote a novel jointly that was published under both their names. They seemed to solidify their marriage, which had come under a bit of pressure around this affair that Johnston had in London. And they moved to Hydra with Clift pregnant and seemingly in a good position in their lives. But things come undone pretty quickly once they got to Hydra. A new child in the household put a lot of pressure on them. They'd use whatever funds they had to buy this house, which consumed all their savings and resources. And almost immediately, the dream of writing literary fiction went off the rails. And Johnston was forced to write what he thought was a very commercial form of novels. And most of that centred around a group of detective novels that he wrote using a pseudonym of Shane Martin, which is using the names of his 2 oldest children, and a character of Professor Chalice. The first of them seems to have sold very well and probably did make money. The next 4 of them probably sold increasingly lower amounts. And financially, they were strained for all that time. And this had 2 effects. One, it left them very stuck on Hydra, whereas they'd had this dream of travelling the Aegean and spending 6 months on an island and 6 months just journeying through the Mediterranean, where they both had this great love of Greek mythology and Greek history they wanted to explore, but they couldn't get off the island to do that, coupled with the fact that Johnston found himself not writing what he wanted to write. You know, he was writing these so-called pot boilers to try and boil the pot. And it also meant that he became a man under great pressure very quickly. And I think he saw probably within the first 12 months of being there that this might be an unsustainable lifestyle, but for reasons he couldn't control, they still had almost a decade to run.
While he's on the island, they do live in poverty, he becomes ill. So he gets to the island at 42. By the time he leaves the island, he's a terminally ill man.
He had a diagnosis in 1957 of tuberculosis. He actually thought he had a cancer and was kind of waiting to die, but the diagnosis was somewhat less severe than that. But he was instructed by his doctors, not surprisingly, to adopt a much healthier lifestyle, which meant giving up cigarettes and giving up alcohol. And George was never going to give up either cigarettes or alcohol. And I kind of think he accepted at that point that he wasn't going to live a long life or a healthy life. And he began to rethink, what he could do to try and achieve this dream he still had of writing quality fiction. But certainly his unwellness and the treatment he was receiving had a great impact upon their relationship, primarily because George became sexually dysfunctional, and he famously described himself as a once-a-year man, and Charmian pretty quickly concluded that she wasn't a once-a-year woman, and she began to find other relationships amongst the expatriate community on the island.
When I read about George Johnston and when I see some of the photos of him during his time as a journalist, he seems to have been quite a bon vivant. And there's an element of humour and good cheer about him. And my impression is that the biggest difference between George Johnston and the character of David Meredith, the fictional character, is quite a miserable man, and he's stuck in his misery, and he's seen appalling things in the war. He's unsure as to whether there's any meaning in anything, and he's got this sense of being an inauthentic human being. And at the end of Clean Straw for Nothing, when he comes back to Australia, having written My Brother Jack, winning the Miles Franklin Award, virtually the last lines in the book were, he knows as the plane's coming in that he's an alien and he'll always be an alien. Yeah. But he was quite a bon vivant, and those photos of James Burke's with him showing people around the island.
He was a greatly sociable man. I mean, they were a greatly sociable couple, and they took very seriously their responsibility as the expat community began to grow around them and more artists and writers came to the island. They wanted to be at the centre of that, and they self-consciously kind of placed themselves as kind of the older figures within that community. And they took very seriously the role of kind of almost mentoring younger writers, and they would be invited into the household, which kind of formed the inner sanctum of the community on the island, was the big kitchen table around which they gathered in the evenings, and And so many people, their first experience of going to the island was being swept up by Johnston and Clift and carried off up the hillside to their house. But of course, we don't know what lies beneath that. And there's no doubt, if we read, as I think we have to, the character of David Meredith as a faithful reproduction of his internal life, he was deeply conflicted at the same time. There's no doubt he carried huge burdens from the war. He had seen some awful things when he was working in China. He went to both Nagasaki and Hiroshima very shortly after the bombs were dropped. And I think he came back to Australia in some ways a man in need of rebuilding. And in part of that was perhaps breaking up his first marriage and taking up a relationship with Clift.
So we'll come back to you, Tanya. Leonard Cohen. We all know who Leonard is. Could you tell us what part does Leonard play in the story of George and Charmian?
The part that Leonard Cohen plays gets back to the part that Hydra plays in Cohen's life, I think. So when Leonard Cohen is thought of today, very often the name of Hydra is connected to Cohen, and there is a sense this is so because Hydra was the formative years. The years that Cohen was on Hydra were the formative years of his career. So when Leonard Cohen came to Hydra, he wasn't Leonard Cohen, if I can put it that way. He was a young Canadian poet. He wasn't supposed to be on Hydra. He was supposed to be in London on a government grant, kind of bashing out a novel, but instead he found himself on Hydra. And within kind of months of being on the island, he bought a house, so kind of paralleling the gesture that Clift and Johnston made in terms of making that connection with the island. And subsequent to that, Cohen went back and forth to the island, perhaps unlike what Paul was saying with regard to Clift and Johnston, who often felt themselves marooned on the island. Cohen was one of the figures that could indeed travel. So he went to and from London and Montreal and Cuba and you name it. So those travels became more frequent into the later 60s, but he still saw Hydra as an escape, as it were. Whereas for Clift and Johnston, it was their home and from somewhere that they couldn't escape, even if they wanted to, and that was many times they did want to. So in terms of what role Cohen plays in the Clift and Johnston story and vice versa, when Cohen in later years reflected on his time on Hydra, and he was asked to do this often, he would very often evoke the memory of Clift and Johnston, which suggests, I think, the centrality that he saw them in his living on Hydra. So he would speak of them as being kind of larger than life. They lived more, they loved more, they drank more. And he, I think, really admired their commitment to art. So that was something that Cohen really saw in them. And in turn, this is what Clift and Johnston saw in Cohen as well. So we were fortunate to see a number of letters and have access to various people's kind of witnessing of Cohen arriving on the island. And we get the impression that Johnston and Clift saw in Cohen almost immediately a kind of kindred spirit, someone who was looking to take seriously writing as an art, and someone who wasn't just there to lie about in the sun and have a good time. They kind of saw in Cohen someone who reflected their own ambitions. And Cohen was some years younger than Clift and Johnston, but this was part of that idea of Clift and Johnston seeing themselves as these generous mentors for younger writers. So in that sense, Cohen, if you like, offered Clift and Johnston a kind of mirror for their own ambitions, and in turn, Cohen looked back on Clift and Johnston with great affection for the generosity and also encouragement that they extended to both himself and other young artists and writers who turned up on the island.
Cohen actually said something very powerful about Clift and Johnston. Could I ask you to read that?
It's on the back of our book, so I'll just have to quote from the blurb. But he says, "They had a larger-than-life, a mythical quality. They drank more than other people. They wrote more. They got sick more. They got well more. They cursed more and they blessed more. And they helped a great deal more. They were an inspiration. They had guts. They were real, tough, honest. They were the kind of people you meet less and less."
I think that's incredibly high praise, and I also think that there is a mythical quality about Johnston and Clift. And when you were speaking earlier, I mean, one of the things about Clift, she was a powerful woman, and a very dramatic figure.
Yes, many people who were on the island at the time spoke of Clift's presence, that she was this kind of incredibly confident, sexually confident, but also just a sense of her own ambition as well. And many would talk about the Agora Act, as it was called, that she and Johnston would perform on the fringe, the harbour side, where they gathered to eat and drink and discuss and argue and philosophise. And there was that kind of passion injected, so there was no holding back, as it were. The island, it was very small, very intimate. The sounds ricocheted off this harbour, Horseshoe Harbour, and also the housing was very closed as well, so there was really no privacy. And the kinds of explosions and passions that might otherwise have been kept in the private sphere were very much made public at the time, so that kind of exuberance was very much on display.
Paul, there's a fascinating character in your book, Redmond Wallace, and he calls to mind a line of George Johnston's. George said if Judas was alive today, he'd be a journalist. And Redmond Wallace desperately wanted to be a writer of fiction and wasn't, but he was a great observer, and he's a really interesting voice in your book.
He absolutely is. He became essential to our research and to the way in which we could tell the story, because he had the advantage of being there, and something that we've been deprived of. And he was giving witness to his experience in his correspondence, in his diaries and in his fiction. He left behind a very large, lengthy, rambling, unpublished novel that sits in manuscript in the National Library of New Zealand, which we've managed to draw upon for its kind of testimony to what it was like to be on the island and amongst this community.
Can you tell? Well, he said a lot of interesting things. For example, he's the one who wrote the line, is he not, that George, when Leonard Cohen took the grant from the Canadian government, and George was disapproving and said that Leonard had become insincere and shallow?
George fluctuated on the question about government grants. He was very opposed to them when anybody else got one, but if he thought one might be coming his way, he thought they were a wonderful investment.
Yeah.
But yeah, Cohen suffered the scorn of a lot of the others on the island because he did have a bit of a source of income from that was kind of denied to the others there, and it was something that Wallace was certainly angling for, and for a time he did also have some support from the New Zealand government.
Was it his line at the end when Charmian was drinking a lot, when they were starting to talk about the fact that people on the island were tiring of seeing her public squabbles with Johnston,
Yeah.
and she was getting drunk, and I think he wrote falling in her food.
Yeah. There's no doubt that towards the end of the period of the island that Johnston and Clift's drinking became much more extreme, and their public argumentation became much more extreme. Even though this is the period, they were actually working and collaborating very, very much together on My Brother Jack was being written. But I think George, by this stage, was totally frustrated with life on the island. He was keen to come back to Australia, whereas Charmian wasn't. And this was just one more thorn in their relationship. And Wallace was an observer of all that. He saw them in their better times, he saw them in their worst of times as well. But there's no doubt that he recorded, again through his correspondence diaries and his manuscript, that kind of general erosion, or that ongoing erosion of their role within the community, and also in the ways in which the community was changing. Because in the Greek islands, between that period, between 1955 and 1964, there was a gradual and massive shift in terms of the tourism and the development that was taking place across the whole region. And what had once been a very quiet backwater was suddenly becoming a focus of kind of geographic desire for day trippers, for the beat generation as a whole, for backpackers, for all sorts of people who were gravitating towards the Aegean. And this put a lot of pressure onto what had been for a number of years a fairly small, closed and insular and supportive community.
one of the, well, another part of your book that I found fascinating is that with these successive waves of visitors, you're getting successive waves of writers. So you're starting to get the Beat generation coming, and to the Beat generation, they're a very post-war movement. To them, Clift and Johnston are old hat. And amongst the arts community, there were some who saw them as hacks who just wrote for money and didn't think they could write.
Yeah, absolutely. Clift and Johnston were kind of generationally unaligned to the Beats, and were probably temperamentally unaligned to them as well. Because first and foremost, what Clift and Johnston did maintain was a huge work ethic across the time on the island. And they saw this younger generation of what they call the post-war generation just drifting onto the island with kind of pretensions to be part of an existentialist generation, but perhaps not either having the ambition or the desire to really turn their shoulder to the wheel. Because Johnston Clift remained, no matter what was going on in their lives, they remained productive. And in a sense, they fell between generations too. They weren't part of the kind of first wave of expatriation that preceded the Second World War. They weren't, that flooded into Paris and the other major European capitals out of the US. The golden age of US expatriation to the literary capitals of Europe. And they weren't part of the Beat generation either. And they were out of step with most of those who came to the island who were younger than them. And they were, for people who were living a very bohemian lifestyle, there was something slightly conservative about them too, in terms of what they viewed as being fine writing.
Yeah.
And what they were trying to achieve was pretty much unaligned with the styles of writing that were being experimented with in the late 50s and early 60s, the kind of sweep of high modernism into literature in that period.
Yep. This book's got many, many great stories in it. One of the ones which really struck me was that when My Brother Jack finally sold and Johnston and Clift got a cheque and they went to the store where they had been living on credit, Catseekers? Yeah. And Rodney Hall, the poet, went with them, and he said their debt equalled some thousands of pounds in sterling. I did a bit of research. In 1964, £1,000 equalled in 2014 £20,000 sterling. That means about 30,000 Australian dollars. That's a phenomenal debt for a little store owner on a Greek island to allow someone to run up. So that's just to me, just a fascinating detail I learnt reading this book. What's your favourite story from the book?
I have many. Can I just add a footnote to that though? Because they made, excuse me, when they received the cheque, they made a great ceremony to give the Catseekers family back the money. And it was an unwritten rule, which was fiercely stood by, that anyone who left the island had to do it only after they'd paid back the Catseekers family, because that generosity extended to many of the expats, and it's, without their support, they would not have been able to survive. So it was a great ceremony was taking place, and the Catseekers owner was very much touched by the gesture. And when they did this, he asked for Charmian's basket. She handed it over, was very kind of formal, and he filled it with goods, dried dates and everything else, and handed it back to her as a kind of gift back to them. So it was a lovely kind of exchange and a kind of important moment, thinking about the way in which Clift and Johnston socialised and were accepted in that community as well. So that's just something to think about. My favourite story, I'm not sure whether I have a favourite one, I have lots of them, but I do have a story to tell with a Leonard Cohen connection. And it has to do with an American psychiatrist by the name of Sheldon Cholst, who was very much into experimenting with drugs, was interested in looking at the psychology of artists, and was basically part of this beat hippie generation that was finding its way through the Aegean and into Turkey at the time. And he found himself on Hydra and struck up a friendship with Leonard Cohen. They had many things in common. They had an interest particularly in drugs, so this is when drugs were increasingly feeding into the island's lifestyle. And this was a relatively new thing, but Cohen's drug taking and his writing is perhaps well known and it's worth mentioning. But Sheldon Cholst also represented for us someone who came with these literary ambitions but didn't necessarily find expression at the time. So in 1964 he published a book of poems about Hydra titled Hydra, Summer 1962. And it was a rather startling volume of poems. It had lines like, Marianne, 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 who has an Axel and a Leonard, and other kinds of literary tomes on this time. So I just want to read out a poem which I hope won't give you indigestion after lunch. But it's kind of indicative, I guess, of some of the literary ambitions that Clift and Johnston were brushing up against. So Clift and Johnston were there to write serious literature, and this is one example of what was happening around them. I play music when I kiss, silent music upon the lips and mouth. My tongue plays against a girl's teeth as if I played a xylophone. I have bitten lips as if they were the tastiest meat this side of heaven. I have sucked upon lips as if they contained rare juice of pomegranate, which I don't think I've tasted yet. I've munched upon lips as if they were delicious crackers and I was starving. I have reached depths unheard of by others, for my tongue is long. I do not like to eat cooked tongue. It seems a crime to cook tongue. But, fresh and alive, I roll it around in my mouth and taste its rare ecstasy. Now, there's no reason to believe that Clift had read that volume, but if she had, it was kind of a moment that suggested everything that was wrong with these dreamers and drifters as she saw them kind of clogging up her island. So she and Johnston were very much there to write serious literature, and this is what was produced by some of those who turned up on their doorstep.
What's your favourite story?
I'd go to the last period of their time on Hydra, Martin. A little bit of a backstory. Cohen was off the island, and Redmond Wallace, who we've spoken about, had access to his house. Cohen, whenever he was off the island, would lend his house to people free of charge, and Wallace was living there in poverty and needed somewhere to stay, so he and his wife Robin were put up in the Cohen house for about 6 or 8 months. And during this period, it was just after George had left the island, because he left in 1964 early to come back to Australia for the publication of My Brother Jack, and Charmian left in August the same year after the children had finished the school year. And it was a period in which Charmian caused probably the most problem on the island. She was obviously drinking very heavily, and she started a relationship with a British painter called Tony Kingsmill. And as soon as Johnston had moved off the island, she moved Kingsmill into the house with the children. And although the community was very tolerant of sexual transgression in all sorts of ways, this was one they couldn't stand, the fact that George had been replaced in the family home by Anthony Kingsmill. So they were getting very kind of annoyed with Charmian, who as I said was drinking very heavily. Part of the story of Cohen coming to the island was that not only did Johnston and Clift put Cohen up in their house for a while as soon as he arrived, but they also lent him some furniture, or gave him some furniture that consisted apparently of a bed, a table and a bookshelf, and other items as well. And Cohen had then had those in his house for some 4 years, given to him in 1960. And 1964, as Charmian's about to leave the island, Leonard's still got the furniture in his house. Charmian declares that she wants it back because she's going to take it home to Australia. Now, she's coming back to Australia on a migrant ship. She'll be lucky to get one suitcase of luggage onto the ship, but she's going to carry this bed back to her, and the bookcase and the table. And she sends a donkey boy up to the house to get the furniture back and takes away the bed. Wallace panics because Charmian's announcing that she's going to come back and collect the rest of the furniture later. And he writes a letter to Cohen in which he describes Charmian turning up with her hair wild and all over the place and her eyes looking like 2 piss holes in the snow, he says. And he wants to know from Cohen, he wants some instructions what to do when she comes back again looking for the rest of the furniture. Now, in a sense, there's no punchline to that story because she next writes to Cohen, Wallace next writes to Cohen a couple of weeks later and declares that he hasn't heard any more about this and that perhaps she's forgotten about it. Cohen's one response was, he said, don't struggle too hard to save either the furniture or the friendship. But it may not, the story may not have a punchline, but it does have a couple of footnotes. One is that on his last album, Leonard, as you know, the last album you may know was called You Want It Darker, and it was kind of his signing off album that was released a couple of weeks before his death, and there are a lot of poems there about departure and leaving and dying, and it was taken to be a very conscious statement on his own mortality. But he has a song on the album called Leaving the Table, in which he writes about departure as getting up and moving away from what is effectively the table. And I thought, well, this could well be the table that was first left by Johnston and Clift to Cohen, and then was left on the island when they left, and now it's a statement by Leonard that he's going to get up and walk away from that same table, which I'm sure is still there in his house in Hydra somewhere. And the other footnote was that this was referred to by Wallace in his correspondence as the flowery bed. We're not quite sure what he meant by the flowery bed, but he described it to Cohen in those terms. And I noticed that yesterday Christie's have put a whole lot of correspondence between Cohen and Marion Island on the market for sale. They're kind of love letters that they wrote when they were on and off the island to each other. And in it, Cohen is returned to Hydra, and he's waiting for Island to come and join him, and he's missing her badly. And he says, I want you to come and share with me the flowery bed. So what we thought was a throwaway line by Wallace, just referring to this flowery bed, was in fact something that was it was commonly known as was the flowery bed. So I think that's kind of a story which encapsulates just the relationships that had kind of emerged within the community at the time it was beginning to disintegrate. And I think we can say about that community that after Johnston and Clift left, it was never the same. And Wallace recognised that in his diary too. He said, I'm not sorry to see George go, but I know the island was changed by his coming and will be changed by his leaving.
So we're going to go to questions. I just have one more question. We are here today because they are writers. Is there just a brief passage you could read that sums up Charmian Clift for you as a writer, and from George Johnson?
Sure. This, for me, is a passage of sunny optimism. I thought of the safe anonymity, this is Clift writing, of the office desk, the furnished flat, the monthly salary check, the insurance policy, the hot, stale smell of the herd, and the will-less, witless way one had of shambling along in the middle of it. It had seemed a glad thing to declare against all that, to declare for individuality, for risks instead of safety, for living instead of existing, for faith in one's ability to build a good, rich life from the raw materials of the man, the woman, the children, and the talents we could muster up between us. We will go and live in the sun, we had said, and George had got up from his desk and walked out, whistling.
I'm leaving you, Martin.
Me?
If I don't have my glasses, I won't read anything. I seem to be sans glasses. We'll give it a try, though. Nathan, thank you. You're a lifesaver. Thank you. This is a passage from Clean Straw for Nothing. And although, I'll just quickly say too that while obviously George is best remembered for My Brother Jack, I think Clean Straw for Nothing is every bit the equal of My Brother Jack as a novel. Tiny bit of context. George is at home. He notices a well outside. It's covered in timber and has been for decades or hundreds of years. These timbers have been sitting there. And in that time, all the village people have come and carved their names into them, of themselves or their lovers or their partners and their wives. And there's this whole kind of generations of names. And he picks up this wood and he brings it inside to burn it. And he starts to burn the wood tops, and he sits there watching these names being consumed by the flames. And he writes, I was staring at the fire, and the red edges began to stealthily push a black stain all around a name, Fatini. She would be the next to go, I reflected, and wondered who she was, or more probably, who she had been. This prompted the disturbing reflection that the time would come inexorably when somebody quite strange to us would be wondering, as idly, about David and Cressida Meredith, what kind of people we were, what sort of lives we had led, how we had come to be here on this rocky little island of Greece, half a world away from home. Fatini burnt up and then turned into a powder of grey ash, and that was probably the last of her for all time. But tomorrow I will take the ash and sprinkle it around the 3 surviving seedlings of the Australian passion fruit which we have grown from the seeds sent to us from Melbourne. The instructions on the packet said that wood ash was good for stimulating growth, but that is a practical matter really, nothing to do with ritual or sentiment or symbolism. And for me that kind of sums up that kind of notion, that romantic dream that took them to Hydra, which is about the old world, the dead, the histories of the old world feeding the young saplings from the Antipodes. And it's everything to do with sentiment and symbolism.
Okay, questions? Yeah. I think there's a...
Can you just go into the writing process and how you sort of carved up the book between you? Am I interpreting correctly?
It's a question we get asked a lot, and I guess underlying it there's usually a surprise that we could do it together and that our friendship, our collaboration could survive perhaps better than the Johnston and Clift one did as a minor, well, maybe not a minor miracle. In practical terms, we just drafted different parts of it each, and then we would just swap drafts back and forward until we had something that we were both kind of happy to put aside and sign off on. But I must say in that whole process there were rarely moments of disagreement about anything. I think we both kind of developed a certain trust in our capacity to edit each other's work. And I guess underlying that there was a certain kind of similarity just in the way we both write, which made that a fairly comfortable and easy task. So it didn't seem to me at least like a great challenge.
It certainly wasn't economical in the sense that it was like, Paul, you write chapter 1, I'll write chapter 2, and we'll get this thing done. It was very much collaborative, exchange, blending, so it probably took a lot longer than it might have if we'd done it along a more economical route, but hopefully it's a better book for that.
Anyone else? Mr. Baker?
I'll talk loudly. The movie is coming. Who would you like to see cast as our leading characters?
This is Paul's story, but I'm going to tell it anyway, in the sense that Paul was speaking with Rodney Hall, and they were discussing the possibility of a movie happening, and Rodney Hall's response was, casting Charmian is going to be the most difficult one to do. And I think we both agree with that. So that's not really answering your question, but it is suggesting that the figure of Charmian, the character of Charmian, certainly has its challenges, and finding someone to fill that role will be up to the producers.
I've got my eye on Guy Pearce for George Johnson.
Charmian?
For Charmian.
Yeah, well, that was, yeah, we want Kate as well.
Yeah. Having had a bit of a discussion with the producers last night, it's clear there are limitations on what can be achieved with the budget.
We'll see.
There's another question.
Yeah. So what do you think we can learn from Clift and Johnston, especially since Johnston was able to write quite effectively in challenging circumstances?
Such a great question. What can we learn? That passage that I read out, I think is, for me, maybe not that I think that we're being asked to take some lesson from their experience, but that sense of risking things and taking chances is something that I think they offer. Their experience offers that for at least to think about, but it also had terrible consequences as well. So the title of the book, Half the Perfect World, was intended to capture that ambivalence. These were two people who went to the island. They had their dream. They realised their dream in so many ways, but at the same time, they didn't. And that put great pressures on them as people and their relationship as well. So, yeah, that's a really lovely question to ask.
Yeah, I'd kind of support that, because I think we can't underestimate what a different world they occupied in the 1950s when they went to Hydra. I mean, the kind of notion of running away to remote islands in the sunshine to forge a living isn't that uncommon these days, where we have notions of what self-actualisation might mean that were foreign in the mid-1950s. And the fact that they took the chance, they had a dream and they followed it, and it wasn't fully realised, and there was a price to be paid, but they were prepared to pursue it, whatever the cost might be. And I think that asks us all to reflect upon our own lives and the sorts of decisions that we make about how we choose to live our life.
I'm just wondering why they ended up on Hydra, because it's a very barren, very dry island. There are many other islands in the Aegean which are much more bountiful places to live, but it intrigues me that they ended up on Hydra. Is there a reason for that?
I think there are two quick reasons. One is Clift was pregnant and they had been on Kalymnos. Kalymnos was about a 14-hour ferry ride from Athens, and Hydra is one of the closer islands. In those days it was about 3 hours, so it was much more accessible to medical care. And second was a very cheap island because it had a very large population in the 19th century. At one stage its population was about 30,000 people when Athens had a population of about 4,000. It was a very wealthy island at that stage, and it left behind, as the population shrank during the second half of the 19th century into the 20th century, it left behind a great store of housing, and in some cases very fine and grand houses that could be acquired for very, very cheap sums of money, which is why they were able to afford to buy a house there where they probably couldn't have done it on some of the more desirable islands.
Johnston had also been there to do some work previously in 1954 for one of his novels as well, so it was an island that he was familiar with in that regard. Yeah.
Yep, I think we are.
Yeah, hello.
One more. Oh,
What? No? Yes?
Yeah.
Why did it go so wrong and end so tragically?
Sorry, I quite missed that, but why did it end so tragically?
Yeah.
Tanya.
It's so hard to know how any lives are going to end up. I mean, in retrospect, you can kind of create a narrative arc around their lives. I don't pretend to be a psychologist to kind of analyse it in that sense. I guess in many ways they might not have seen it as a tragedy. In some ways, they might have seen themselves as having a successful career, writing the great Australian novel, having a wonderful career as a journalist in Clift's case as well. So I think their story does have elements of tragedy to it as well, but it also had elements of comedy too. And I wouldn't want to downplay those elements either, though I accept that suicides and those kinds of decisions, if they are that, are incredibly sad. So, yeah, I'm not sure, really. I don't think I have one answer to that would neatly sum up complex human beings that found themselves in complex situations.
There aren't too many stories of two ambitious, highly talented writers marrying and it not ending tragically. All right, I think that's it.
Many thank yous for today. Thank you, Erica, for the wonderful music. Thank you, Harry, for the photos. But especially thank you to our panellists, to Martin, Tanya and Paul. I think that was a fabulous conversation, engrossing. Like Martin, I read My Brother Jack as a kid. Didn't go any further. I need to go back, and I will go back. Recently, in other researches, I came to read quite a few of George Johnston's dispatches as a war correspondent, and was deeply impressed with his talent in that particular area. And of course, the Melbourne Press Club was very pleased last year to induct both Johnston and Clift into our Australian Media Hall of Fame, and they are both indeed outstanding figures of journalism in Australia through all eras. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you again to our panel. See you again.